All right, diving in today, and get this, the topic is feminist environmental philosophy.
Ooh, that sounds like it could get pretty interesting.
It really is. So we're basically going to be looking at how our understanding of, women and our understanding of nature, how those two things are really deeply connected. And for this deep dive, we're going to be relying on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on feminist environmental philosophy.
Solid source.
Yeah.
Always a good starting point.
Yeah. It's super comprehensive, really academically grounded, which is what we want. And what we're going to try to do is, there's a lot there, but we're going to try to unpack the kind of the core concepts, different schools of thought within feminist environmental philosophy, so that by the end here, anyone listening hopefully will have a really clear grasp of this whole field.
That was good. A worthy goal.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that makes this field so interesting is that it offers a pretty unique perspective on some really pressing issues like environmental problems, social justice, things that we are all grappling with in some way or another.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with this central idea, this kind of foundational principle, that nature is a feminist issue.
Now, as a philosopher, that definitely piques my interest. How do those two connect?
Right. And that's what's so cool about this. So the idea here is that our understanding of nature, like the natural world and all of the environmental challenges that we're facing, that's not separate from our understanding of, women's experiences and even at times their oppression.
So it's about recognizing these shared patterns of like domination and exploitation that occur in both realms.
Exactly. The way we conceptualize and treat nature, it often mirrors how we conceptualize and treat women. And vice versa, it goes both ways.
Interesting. So it's more than just saying that women are more connected to nature or something simplistic like that.
Oh, yeah. It goes much deeper than that. And the source actually gives this really striking example to illustrate the point. It talks about how, issues like deforestation, water pollution, environmental toxins, all these things disproportionately impact poor rural women in, less developed countries.
Makes sense, given that they're often the ones responsible for securing resources like water and food and caring for their families. They're on the front lines of environmental degradation.
Right, exactly. And so when those resources are threatened or damaged, they're the ones who bear the brunt of it. And so Gard and Ruin, they make this argument that these environmental problems become feminist issues precisely because of these unequal gendered impacts.
Makes you think about who really suffers the consequences of environmental destruction.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to that powerful statement, nature is a feminist issue, which Warren actually suggests could be considered the informal slogan of this entire field. It really captures that central conviction that these two domains, they're not only connected, but they require simultaneous understanding.
Okay, so we're talking about a pretty radical shift in perspective here.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, how does this all relate to, the bigger picture of Western philosophy? Like, where does feminist environmental philosophy fit in with the traditional canonical thinkers and ideas?
That's a great question. And the source actually goes into this in detail. It talks about canonical Western philosophy, the tradition that goes all the way back to ancient Greece, the philosophers that everyone studies. And it points out that this tradition has some pretty distinct features that feminist environmental philosophy really pushes back against.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, one big one is rationalism, this idea that reason is like the primary source of knowledge and what sets humans apart from, animals and the rest of nature.
Right, that classic human-centric view that often leads to a sense of superiority.
Exactly. And it's not just about reason itself, but it's also about how this tradition often conceives of morality and knowledge. Like, the ideal moral agent is supposed to be totally impartial, detached, not swayed by emotions or personal connections. It's all about objectivity.
And of course, that detached, objective perspective is usually associated with the masculine, while emotions, care, connection with nature, those are often relegated to the feminine.
Precisely. And another huge aspect of this tradition is its reliance on these fundamental dualisms, these binary oppositions like reason versus emotion, mind versus body, culture versus nature. It's all about creating these clear-cut categories and often placing one above the other.
Yeah, and that hierarchical thinking, as we were talking about earlier, plays a significant role in justifying the domination of both women and nature.
Absolutely. And then, this tradition also tends to emphasize this ontological divide between humans and the non-human world. We're over here, they're over there. Humans are often seen as separate and superior. And finally, there's the strong emphasis on universalizability. Ethical principles, knowledge, all of it should apply to everyone in similar situations.
So feminist environmental philosophy is coming in and saying, hold on a second, let's question all of these assumptions.
Exactly. It's challenging those very foundations of like human exceptionalism, the idea of a detached knower, those rigid dualisms. It's asking us to consider, are these frameworks really adequate for understanding the complexities of lived experience and the interconnectedness of, everything?
Okay, so given this critical engagement with traditional philosophy, it sounds like there's a lot of diversity within feminist environmental philosophy itself. What are the main approaches or schools of thought?
Right. So the source helpfully categorizes these into three main kinds of positions. First, you have positions that are rooted in non-feminist Western environmental philosophy. So these are basically established frameworks within environmental ethics, but feminist thinkers have engaged with them, bringing their own analyses and critiques.
Interesting. So taking existing ideas and adding a feminist lens to them. What are some others?
The next big one is ecofeminist philosophy proper. So this is where it really develops its own distinct framework for understanding the connections between, women's experiences and our relationship with nature.
Okay, so this is where the field really comes into its own. What about that last category?
Yeah, the third one is kind of a catch-all for new or emerging standalone positions. So these are more recent developments within the field that are offering, new theoretical perspectives. Some build on the first two categories and some kind of go off in different directions.
Sounds like there's a lot of intellectual ferment happening. Will be exciting to dive into all of this.
It really is. So let's start with that first category, the feminist perspective on non-feminist environmental philosophy. It's interesting to note that Western environmental philosophy as a distinct field, it didn't really emerge until the 1970s.
That's pretty recent considering how long philosophy itself has been around. What prompted that emergence?
Well, a few things. It was partly a response to the growing awareness of all these environmental problems like, pollution, deforestation. And there were also these growing ethical concerns about how animals were being treated, especially with the rise of factory farming. Plus, you had more and more people questioning those old assumptions about human superiority over nature.
It was a moment of reckoning, in a way. We can't just keep treating the planet and its inhabitants as if they have no intrinsic value.
Exactly. And so this new environmental philosophy, and this includes both feminist and non-feminist thinkers, it really made this foundational claim that marked a big shift from the traditional view. It started arguing that humans actually have direct moral responsibilities to non-human animals and to nature itself.
So it's not just about how our actions affect other humans indirectly. We have obligations to these other beings in their own right.
Exactly. Some were arguing for this based on the intrinsic value of nature or animals, the idea that they have value just because they exist, regardless of whether they're useful to us. Others focused on things like sentience, the ability to feel pain and experience things, or the idea that animals might have rights. But the key point is this expansion of moral consideration beyond just humans.
Okay, so we've got this broader landscape of environmental philosophy emerging. Where do the feminists come in?
Well, feminist thinkers start bringing these really unique and important perspectives to the table, and one area where this is really clear is in animal ethics. So within this category of revised environmental philosophy, we see feminist perspectives on animal ethics really taking shape.
Okay, revised meaning.
So revised in this context means that they're taking some of the key concepts from traditional philosophy, ideas like rights or the capacity for suffering, and they're saying, hey, these should apply to non-human animals too. And that's what animal ethics is all about in general.
Right, expanding the moral circle to include animals. But what specifically are the feminists adding to this conversation?
They're bringing this crucial gendered dimension to the discussion, and the source highlights 6 key contributions that feminist animal ethics has made. So first of all, it challenges the human nature dualism head on. Feminist animal ethicists remind us that, hey, guess what? Humans are animals too. We're part of the natural world, even though we have this capacity for reason.
It breaks down that artificial barrier that we've created between us and the rest of nature.
Right. And then the second contribution is about highlighting these connections, often really disturbing connections, between violence against women, violence against nature, and even the exploitation that you see in pornography. Thinkers like Carol Adams and Susan Griffin, they've done some really groundbreaking work in this area, showing how these different forms of violence are actually linked by these underlying patriarchal structures.
So it's not just about individual acts of violence, but about recognizing these larger systems of domination that connect them.
Exactly. The third big contribution focuses on language. Feminist thinkers have shown how the language we use can actually reinforce the exploitation of both women and animals.
That's so important. Language isn't neutral. It carries all these implicit meanings and assumptions.
Absolutely. And then fourthly, they point out how those dualisms that we talked about earlier, like culture, nature, mind, body, they've never been neutral in how they're applied. Men are historically associated with, culture, mind, reason, the supposedly superior side of things, while women and animals get relegated to nature, body, emotions, seen as the inferior side.
Yeah, and that hierarchical structuring has huge implications for how both women and animals have been treated throughout history.
Yeah.
It justifies their subordination.
Exactly. The fifth point that feminists emphasize is that the domination of women and the domination of animals, these aren't isolated phenomena. They're actually deeply embedded in these mutually reinforcing systems of domination. So you have sexism, which is prejudice and discrimination based on sex, working hand in hand with speciesism, prejudice based on species. They prop each other up.
And that makes it so much harder to dismantle either one without addressing the other. They're intertwined.
Precisely. And then the final contribution, and I think this is really crucial from a philosophical standpoint, is that feminist animal ethicists question whether traditional animal ethics, approaches that don't account for gender, can ever really be complete or adequate.
It's like they're saying, you're missing a huge part of the picture if you don't consider the role of gender in all of this.
Right. They argue that failing to consider gender leads to all these blind spots and an incomplete ethical framework. So that's kind of the overview of feminist perspectives on animal ethics. It's a rich area with a lot of important insights.
It definitely is. So much to think about. So what's next in this first category?
Well, the source then goes on to discuss something called expanded environmental philosophy, specifically focusing on feminist perspectives on Aldo Leopold's land ethic.
Ah, Leopold, a classic in environmental philosophy.
Right. His work is so influential. And what distinguishes these expanded philosophies from the revised ones is that they don't just extend moral considerations to new entities, they introduce completely new ethical dimensions and concepts.
Okay, I'm following. So remind me, what's the gist of Leopold's land ethic?
Well, he's most famous for this idea that the moral community should include not just humans, but also soil, water, plants, animals, the whole land.
That's a pretty radical departure from the traditional anthropocentric view.
It really is.
Yeah.
And he argues that humans need to shift from seeing themselves as conquerors of the land to just plain members and citizens within this larger community.
So we're not separate or superior to nature, but part of it, interwoven with it.
Exactly. And another key point he makes is that morality is deeply connected to our capacity for understanding, feeling, love, respect, admiration, even faith.
So our ethics are rooted in our relationship with the natural world. It's not just about abstract principles, but about how we connect with and value the world around us.
Right. And then he lays out this famous moral maxim, which is that an action is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and wrong when it doesn't.
So right action is about maintaining the health and wholeness of the ecosystem. That's the ultimate goal.
Exactly. And feminist environmental philosophers find a lot to connect with in Leopold's work. They especially resonate with this idea of a relational self, one that is, interconnected with the larger ecological community.
Which makes sense, given their emphasis on relationships and interconnectedness.
Right. And they also really appreciate his focus on moral emotions like empathy and care as key elements of a strong environmental ethic. Thinkers like Cuomo, Plumwood, Warren, they've all written extensively about the importance of these emotions in our relationship with the natural world.
So it's not just about cold, hard logic. It's about cultivating those feelings of connection and responsibility. I like that.
Yeah, it's a really important aspect of this whole perspective. And it's also worth noting that some feminist thinkers have pointed out what they see as embryonic forms of a gendered ethic, even within Leopold's own writing.
Oh, really? I'm curious. Give me an example.
Well, he mentions this passage from Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus's slave girls are treated as property alongside the land itself. And feminist thinkers have argued that this hints at these historical parallels in how both women and nature have been objectified and treated as resources to be exploited.
That's a really interesting connection. It makes you think about how deep-seated those patterns of domination are.
It really does. And another thing that's relevant to feminist environmental philosophy is Leopold's understanding of the link between cultural diversity and ecological diversity.
Ah, that makes sense. different cultures have different ways of interacting with and valuing their environments.
Exactly. He recognized how diverse cultures often arise from and are dependent upon the specific natural environments they inhabit. And he saw a real threat to both culture and ecology in the way that, Western development projects were often replacing these diverse indigenous forests, which were often managed sustainably by women, with these large-scale monoculture plantations.
That's such a powerful example of how ecological destruction and cultural destruction go hand in hand, and how women are often disproportionately affected by those processes.
Exactly. So we've covered revised environmental philosophy, looking at feminist perspectives on animal ethics, and we've talked about expanded environmental philosophy, focusing on Leopold's land ethic. And now we get to the final piece of this first category, which is radical environmental philosophy. And specifically, we're going to look at feminist philosophical perspectives on deep ecology.
Deep ecology, okay. I know a bit about that, but remind me of the basics.
Yeah, so deep ecology was really spearheaded by the Norwegian philosopher Arne Naess. And the basic idea was to delve into the deep, philosophical roots of the environmental crisis. And they contrasted this with more shallow ecological approaches that were just focused on addressing the symptoms, like pollution, without really questioning the underlying worldviews that were causing these problems.
Right, so it's about getting to the core of the issue, not just putting Band-Aids on it.
Exactly. And there was initially a lot of overlap and even collaboration between early ecofeminists and people who were into deep ecology.
Interesting. But I'm guessing it wasn't all smooth sailing.
Not exactly. In the 80s and 90s, a pretty significant debate emerged, with ecofeminists offering some pretty pointed critiques of deep ecology from a feminist perspective.
That makes sense. There were bound to be some points of tension.
Right. And one of the most insightful and influential critiques came from the Australian philosopher Val Plumwood. And she basically argued that while deep ecology is good at critiquing anthropocentrism, the idea that humans are the center of everything, it often fails to recognize how anthropocentrism is also a form of androcentrism, or male-centered thinking.
So it's not just about dismantling human dominance over nature, but also about understanding how that dominance is intertwined with male dominance.
Exactly. And Plumwood also took issue with deep ecology's central principle of self-realization, the idea of expanding the self to merge with a larger cosmic or ecological self. And she argued that this concept, even though it aims to overcome separation, actually keeps intact the very discontinuity thesis, the idea of a radical separation between humans and nature, that deep ecology claims to reject.
So it's a bit of a paradox. In trying to overcome separation, it ends up reinforcing it in a way.
Yeah, it's subtle but important. And Plumwood went on to analyze 3 different conceptions of the self that were prevalent in deep ecology: the indistinguishable self, the expanded self, and the transcendent self. And she argued that each of these, in different ways, either erases important distinctions between humans and nature, diminishes the importance of individual human experience, or presupposes this problematic triumph over our embodied and relational connections to the world.
So she's saying that deep ecology's idea of self-realization can be pretty problematic if it's not carefully thought through.
Right. And she offered an alternative view of the self as being both continuous with and distinct from nature, both individual and ecological, interdependent and relational. And her view emphasizes the importance of relationality and interconnectedness, but without erasing the individual or those important distinctions between self and other.
That's a nuanced perspective. She's trying to find a balance between those different poles.
Exactly. And it leads us nicely into the second major category of positions within feminist environmental philosophy, which is ecofeminist philosophy itself.
Okay, so we're finally getting to the heart of the matter.
We are. And it's interesting to note that the term ecological feminism, or ecofeminism for short, was actually coined back in 1974 by a French feminist named Françoise Daubonne. But even though the term was coined then, it didn't really solidify as a distinct philosophical position with its own theoretical frameworks until the late 80s and early to mid-90s.
So it took some time for those ideas to really coalesce into a distinct philosophical approach.
It did. And for our purposes here, we can think of ecofeminist philosophy as having 3 main interconnected goals. First, it wants to explore the connections between the domination of women and the domination of nature.
So understanding how those 2 forms of domination are intertwined and mutually reinforcing.
Right. Secondly, it critiques male-biased or patriarchal perspectives that have shaped how we understand both women and nature.
So it's about uncovering and challenging those deep-seated biases that are often invisible or taken for granted.
Exactly. And then thirdly, it aims to develop alternative frameworks, ethical perspectives and solutions that challenge these patterns of domination.
So it's not just about critique, it's about offering a different vision, a different way forward.
Right. It's about both dismantling the old and building something new.
Okay, I'm really starting to see how powerful and multifaceted this approach is.
It really is. And one thing that a lot of ecofeminist philosophers emphasize is this distinction between the oppression of women and the domination of nature.
Ah, yes. That's an important nuance. Explain that.
So the term oppression is generally seen as being more appropriate when you're talking about beings who possess certain capacities like rationality, sentience, or agency. Domination, on the other hand, is often used more broadly to describe the unjustified control or exploitation of, nature, which traditionally hasn't been thought of as possessing those same capacities.
So while ecofeminists certainly address the oppression of non-human animals, they tend to talk about the domination of nature more broadly.
Precisely. And one of the core concepts in ecofeminist philosophy is that of oppressive conceptual frameworks. These are like the underlying sets of beliefs, values, and assumptions that shape how we see the world. And crucially, some of these frameworks actually work to justify and maintain unjust systems of domination.
So they're like the intellectual scaffolding for oppression. And I'm guessing these frameworks have a long history in Western thought.
They do. And when these frameworks are patriarchal, they work to systematically justify the subordination of women. And here's where Warren's concept of the isms of domination comes in, sexism, racism, classism, all of that. She argues that these different forms of oppression share common conceptual roots. They're not totally separate things.
Fascinating. So what are those common roots?
She identifies 5 key features of an oppressive framework. So first, there's this tendency toward value hierarchical thinking, often called up-down thinking. So you rank things, and those that are deemed up, like men or culture, are considered more valuable and deserving than those that are down, like women or nature.
Okay, so creating these hierarchies that privilege certain groups and devalue others. What's next?
That the second feature is oppositional value dualisms. These are pairs of concepts like reason versus emotion, where the two are not only seen as distinct, but one is considered better than the other. And typically, the one associated with maleness or culture is the one that's valued more.
Right, so it reinforces those hierarchies we were just talking about.
Exactly. And then the third and fourth features are about power and privilege. In oppressive frameworks, power is conceived of and exercised in ways that benefit those who are already in a position of power.
Which creates a vicious cycle. Those in power use their power to maintain their power and privilege.
Right. And privilege, of course, is also unequally distributed. It goes to those who are already on the upside of things.
So it's all interconnected. The hierarchies, the dualisms, the power imbalances, the unequal distribution of privilege, they all work together to maintain systems of oppression. What's that 5th feature?
Ah, yes. The 5th one is the logic of domination. This is the idea that superiority in one or more valued attributes justifies subordination.
So if you're seen as superior in some way, then it's okay to dominate or control those who are seen as inferior. It's a dangerous way of thinking.
It really is. And it's important to point out that while the first 4 features can exist in different social arrangements, it's the presence of that logic of domination that really defines a truly oppressive relationship.
That makes sense. So it's not just about hierarchies or power imbalances in general, but about how those things are used to justify the subordination of certain groups.
Right. And Warren argues that these 5 features, taken together, help us see how the dominations of women, animals, and nature are all interconnected. They share these common roots.
That's a powerful insight. It helps us see the bigger picture, the systemic nature of these problems.
It does. And another important area that ecofeminist philosophy explores is linguistic perspectives. So they're really interested in the role of language in shaping our thought and reinforcing these oppressive conceptual frameworks.
Language is so powerful. It shapes how we perceive the world and how we relate to each other.
It really is. And ecofeminists draw on the work of Wittgenstein, who argued that language isn't just this neutral tool for describing reality. It actually reflects and shapes our underlying worldviews.
So the language we use can either perpetuate oppressive systems or help us challenge them.
Exactly. And one way that language does this is through the way it often animalizes and naturalizes women. So you see all these animal terms used to demean women, to put them down. Yeah. And there's also this tendency to associate women with the natural realm, which is often seen as inferior to the realm of human culture.
Right. It's like saying that women are somehow closer to animals or less civilized than men.
Exactly. And then on the flip side, you have the feminization of nature. So we talk about Mother Nature, whose secrets are to be penetrated and whose resources are to be raped or mined.
It's such violent and exploitative language. And it's not accidental. It reflects a certain way of seeing and relating to the world.
Exactly. And Carol Adams, in her work, argues that these linguistic patterns, they actually describe, reflect, and perpetuate patriarchal domination. They make it seem natural and inevitable, obscuring the fact that it's a system that's been created and maintained by humans.
So language isn't just reflecting reality, it's actually shaping reality.
Right. And it's important to acknowledge that, animal and nature language is sometimes used to describe men too. And not all of it is necessarily negative. But the key point is that within a patriarchal context, the function of this language is different for women, animals, and nature. It reinforces their devaluation and their continued domination.
So it's about paying attention to the power dynamics at play, to how language is being used to reinforce those power structures.
Exactly. Now, the source also delves into historical perspectives on these connections between the domination of women and nature, and it acknowledges that the historical causes are complex and still debated. But Carolyn Merchant's work on the scientific revolution is particularly influential in this area.
Interesting. What's her argument?
So she argues that this shift in Western thought from an older, more organic view of nature, where nature was often seen as this benevolent, nurturing female entity, to a more modern, mechanistic view of nature as like inert, passive, dead, that this shift played a crucial role in justifying the exploitation of nature.
Ah, that makes sense. If nature is seen as a machine, then it's easier to exploit it without guilt or moral qualms.
Right. Like the idea of mining the Earth's womb, that had a lot more moral weight when people still thought of the Earth as a living, nurturing being.
Yeah.
But once you start seeing it as just this dead machine, those ethical concerns kind of fade away.
So the way we conceive of nature has huge implications for how we treat it, and how we treat women, for that matter.
Exactly. And then we move into socioeconomic perspectives, and specifically this branch of ecofeminism called materialist ecofeminism. This perspective draws on Marxist analysis to emphasize how economic and material conditions shape these systems of domination.
Okay, so it's bringing in class analysis and political economy into the mix.
Right. And thinkers like Miller, they argue that in societies characterized by what they call capitalist patriarchy, the fact that men predominantly own and control the means of production, this leads to this male-biased allocation of resources and, the exploitation of nature for profit.
So it's about recognizing how capitalism and patriarchy work together to reinforce each other and to exploit both women and nature.
Exactly. And Vandana Shiva's work is really relevant here, too. She talks about how the imposition of Western development models, especially in post-colonial contexts, has often led to what she calls the feminization of poverty. These models, with their focus on, cash crops for export and a gendered division of labor that often pushes women out of their traditional roles in subsistence agriculture, it ends up harming both women and the environment.
It's like these development models are actually maldevelopment, as she calls it, because they create more problems than they solve.
Exactly. And they undermine those traditional ecological practices that were often much more sustainable.
Okay, so we've covered quite a bit of ground here. What's next on the ecofeminist agenda?
Well, next up is epistemological perspective, so how we know what we know. And ecofeminist epistemology is basically taking all those feminist critiques of traditional knowledge production and applying them specifically to the connections between women, knowledge, and nature.
Okay, so it's about questioning who gets to define knowledge, whose knowledge is valued, and how those power dynamics shape what we consider to be true or important.
Exactly. And the Chipko movement in India is a really powerful example of this. These women, they literally hugged trees to stop deforestation. And their actions demonstrated this deep practical knowledge of the local forests, knowledge that was often ignored by Western-trained forestry experts.
They knew the forests intimately. They understood their value for food, fuel, medicine, all these things that the experts often overlooked because they were so focused on commercial timber production.
Right. And their resistance highlighted the harm that was being done by replacing these diverse ecosystems with monoculture plantations.
So it's about recognizing and valuing those different ways of knowing, those lived experiences that are often marginalized.
Exactly. And there was this research in Sierra Leone that showed that women could identify and name significantly more uses for local trees than men could. And this is what they call indigenous technical knowledge, which is often rooted in these lived, gendered experiences with the environment.
So it's not just about women being closer to nature in some sentimental way. It's about them having a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge that's essential for understanding and managing ecosystems sustainably.
Right. And this really challenges those traditional notions of, objective, impartial, detached knowledge.
It's saying that knowledge is always situated, embodied, and shaped by our experiences.
Exactly. And then finally, we come to political perspectives. Ecofeminist political philosophy takes those feminist critiques of traditional political concepts like justice, rights, citizenship, and it expands them to include ecological concerns.
Okay, so it's about bringing environmental issues into the heart of political theory and practice.
Right. And the rise of ecofeminist political activism in the 80s led to the development of this whole range of different ecofeminist approaches. You have liberal ecofeminism, Marxist ecofeminism, socialist ecofeminism, radical ecofeminism, cultural ecofeminism, spiritual ecofeminism, social ecofeminism.
Wow, that's a lot of ecofeminisms. It's clearly a diverse and dynamic movement.
It really is. And thinkers like Ariel Sala argue that the ecological crisis is rooted in a system of Eurocentric capitalist patriarchy that's trying to dominate both nature and, what she calls woman as nature.
So it's about recognizing how those systems of domination are interconnected and how they operate globally.
Right. And then Katrina Sandilands, she emphasizes the democratic vision within ecofeminism and the need for what she calls ecological democracy. So a system that values both ecological integrity and social justice.
So it's not just about environmental protection. It's about creating a more just and equitable society for all.
Exactly. And then Braun Taylor Curtin, she sees the environmental crisis as a crisis of citizenship. And she's developed this concept of the ecological citizen, someone whose responsibilities extend beyond just the human community to include the well-being of the whole planet.
So expanding our sense of belonging, of who we're responsible for and accountable to.
Right. And there's also this growing body of ecofeminist political philosophy within continental philosophy that's focusing on understanding nature as a subject with its own agency and political significance.
Wow, that's really pushing the boundaries of traditional political thought.
It is. So finally, we arrive at ethical perspectives, which the source notes has been the most studied subfield of ecofeminist philosophy. And ecofeminist ethics is really committed to two main things.
Lay it on me.
Okay, so first, it wants to offer a thorough critique of male bias in traditional ethical theories. And then second, it wants to develop alternative, non-male biased ethical frameworks that emphasize values like care, empathy, and relationality.
So it's about exposing the limitations of traditional ethics and creating something more inclusive and responsive to the needs of both women and the natural world.
Exactly. And one of the central concerns of ecofeminist ethics is this focus on the connections between women and nature in its critique of existing ethical systems.
Makes sense. They're highlighting how those connections have been ignored or devalued by traditional ethics.
Right. And there are a few key themes that run through this work. So there's a critique of those mutually exclusive value dualisms, especially the culture-nature dualism. And there's a reconceptualization of the self as